Donald Trump's recent executive actions to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement, the World Health Organization, UNESCO, UNHRC and other United Nations bodies, coupled with a pause to USAID funding, all of it put together mark a seismic shift in global governance. For India, which is a nation that is deeply integrated into these multilateral frameworks, these moves and this withdrawal carries complex implications. The immediate fallout, of course, is going to be from massive disruptions to development programs, and then, of course, there is wide-ranging geopolitical recalibrations. Here's a look at the fallout of reduced American funding and the uncertain road ahead. Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, which is effective immediately, undermines global climate diplomacy. The United States is the world's second largest emitter. It's also a critical contributor to climate financing, including the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund, the GCF, is a fund worth $100 billion that was committed to by the developed countries to give to developing ones, which includes the transfer of climate technology. America's weakness from the Paris Accords weakens collective climate action. It places greater pressure on India and other developing countries to meet their emission targets without any assured financial support from the developed world. India, which is reliant on international funding for renewable energy transitions and for climate adaptation projects, now faces a $2.5 billion annual shortfall in climate financing, which previously was channeled through this US-backed multilateral arrangement. Same with the World Health Organization. The United States, in fact, is the largest contributor to the WHO. In the 24-25 budget, about 18%, which is $1.2 billion out of the total WHO budget of $6.8 billion, came from the United States. America's withdrawal jeopardizes programs in India like polio eradication, tuberculosis control, and pandemic preparedness. These are areas where India heavily depends on WHO expertise. For instance, WHO's technical guidance underpins India's revised National Tuberculosis Control Program. It also underpins the Ayushman Bharat healthcare scheme, which is the world's largest health insurance program for the poor. Reduced funding could also delay vaccine distribution. It could weaken disease surveillance systems, both of which are critical for a nation that is battling antimicrobial resistance and emerging pathogens. The American exit from UNESCO also stops funding for heritage conservation as well as education initiatives in India. Some projects like the UNESCO-protected Taj Mahal could find funding cuts, as a result of which protection of these monuments could become a complicated affair. Meanwhile, disengagement from the United Nations Human Rights Council also disrupts advocacy for many marginalized communities, even though historically India has viewed the UNHRC with some skepticism. And add to all of this the pause of funding of USAID. While USAID's direct allocations to India have diminished in recent years, it still contributes somewhere to the tune of $4 billion in the global health budget, which supports initiatives like HIV/AIDS prevention. It is also a big backer of maternal health programs, both of which are important here in India. The funding freeze risks stalling innovation in public health as well as in clean energy startups, both of which are reliant on American funding grants. Having said that, India has also viewed USAID with deep suspicion in the past, particularly linking it with funding to NGOs, which the government in India says was running an anti-national agenda. In fact, hundreds of such NGOs have had their FCRA licenses barred because of this suspicion. India has also suspected USAID funding going into anti-government and regime change activities in the neighborhood, including in Bangladesh and Myanmar. India's partnership with multilateral agencies is multifaceted. With the WHO alone, there are direct transfers in aid and grant to the tune of $150 million that the agency gives to India every year for immunization, for disease surveillance, and for health workforce training. With the United Nations Development Partnership, for example, a fund of anywhere between $50 to $70 million annually is given for sustainable development, digital inclusion, and disaster resilience. And there is the India-UN Development Partnership Fund, which is an outgoing 150 million India-funded initiative which targets the least developed countries, particularly countries in Africa. It reflects India's growing role as a donor and not just a recipient of international donor funds. The areas in India which receive the maximum multilateral funding includes health, which is 40% of all international funding that comes into India through the WHO and through the Global Health Fund. In climate action, 30%, like I said, the Green Climate Fund, which was a committed fund by the developed world to the tune of $100 billion, India alone was committed something like $2.5 billion. That is now in jeopardy because of Trump retreating. Education and heritage contribute about 15% of the funds that come in. That is primarily through the UN agencies UNESCO and UNICEF. So the question now is, with America retreating, who can fill this void? China has signaled willingness to boost contributions to WHO as also to climate funds because it wants to leverage its growing geopolitical importance. However, India views Chinese funding with deep suspicion. It fears Chinese debt trap diplomacy. As one Indian diplomat recently noted, China's checkbook diplomacy in multilateral forums often prioritizes its own strategic interests over global welfare. In fact, if you look at the examples around India's neighborhood, from Sri Lanka to Maldives to Nepal, even Bangladesh, they've all fallen for Chinese debt trap diplomacy. Now, the EU, the European Union, remains the largest collective donor to all of these UN agencies outside of the US. In fact, it contributes about 30% of the WHO's budget. However, economic stagnation and competing priorities in Europe, for example, dealing with the fallout of the Ukraine war, trying to stop Russia's expansionism, all of this limit Europe's ability to fully offset the American cuts under Trump. Germany and France have both pledged incremental increases to these various UN agencies, but analysts say there needs to be at least a $700 million annual gap, both in climate and in health funding, that needs to be bridged. India is pivoting to bilateral partnerships as well as to South-South cooperation. The India United Nations Fund exemplifies this. India is helping finance projects in 40-plus countries, while at the same time insulating itself from donor dependency. Domestically, the Modi administration is also accelerating schemes like the National Health Mission and the International Solar Alliance to try and mitigate external funding disruptions. Trump's isolationism fractures the post-war liberal order, forcing middle powers like India to navigate a fragmented world. While Europe struggles to lead and China's motives remain suspect, India is likely to strengthen regional alliances through forums like the Quad, even BRICS to an extent, to try and counterbalance. But Trump is not a big fan of BRICS. He's even threatened tariffs against BRIC countries if they were to come up with a BRICS currency that would challenge the dominance of the US dollar. India could also leverage its donor status in forums like the India UN Fund to shape the global agenda when it comes to climate action and disease mitigation. It could also boost domestic spending on health and climate resilience, although it will be constrained by fiscal limits. And as public health expert K. Srinath Reddy warned, unilateralism in a pandemic-era world undermines every nation's security. For India, the challenge lies in balancing strategic autonomy with the urgent need for collaborative solutions to some of these global problems.